Israel firing missiles into northern Gaza as Hamas fires over 45 rockets aimed towards Jerusalem. This is according to new reporting now from the IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Force. It comes as tensions continue to ratchet up in the region following what has been a weeks-long new spate of military. Trey Inks joins us now from Israel with details on the ground. Hi, Trey.
Well, there are several events.
First, most of us have been drowning in news about coronavirus for all of 2020. Occasionally China makes headlines, and when it does, it's only over bans of Australian export products. For far too many Australians, we continue to frame this relationship with China as a juggling act between our economic interests on one hand and our alliance commitments with the United States. In a much more benign era, that Australia does not need to choose between our history or our geography. But that choice has been extinguished by China's increasingly aggressive behaviour. Many in the local China lobby blame Australia for the current crisis in our relations, but that ignores the growing pushback from the EU and many ASEAN states against China's quite naked ambitions. Today, we learned that Australian wheat is the latest industry to be buffeted, with imports to China down to near decade lows amid ongoing trade tensions. To discuss this and Australia's broader national security interest, I'm joined by a man who has served Australia with courage and distinction on the battlefield and is now a senator for New South Wales, Jim Molan, a very familiar contributor on Sky News. Well, Jim, you've used some quite ominous language about a likelihood of a war between the United States and China because of China's increasingly aggressive behaviour both in the South China Sea and towards Taiwan. Do you want to expand a little on what you've had to say on the record today?
Catherine, good evening. Yes, I've spoken about this for some reason, and maybe it's associated with the grey zone conflict that we're in at the moment, but there's been a lot of attention to it in this kind of between Christmas and New Year.
Yeah.
Maybe it's because there's nothing else to talk about, but I reckon there's a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
What I've said is that war between the United States and China is not just possible, it's more likely than most people are prepared to estimate. And by not talking about it, by not admitting the possibility of it, we increase the risk of it occurring. Now, I've never maintained that.
There's more warnings today about the potential for war with China after a senior Australian commander warned soldiers to prepare for the high possibility. Live from California is John Jordan, a Republican strategist and former US Naval Intelligence Officer. John, appreciate your time. Here in Australia, we've been told the drums of war are beating. We're hearing of a Cold War. Today, a former Australian commanding officer warning of a grey war already underway. Is Australia being more hawkish than the US on this front?
So I think Australia is being more realistic about where we are. The trick is understanding conflict that exists on a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. It's not military action or peace. There's economic, there's political, there's intelligence, there's different domains to conflict. And right now, the United States and Australia are engaged in some levels, some domains of conflict with China already. It hasn't escalated, it hasn't gotten very hot, but certainly in terms of economics, that conflict has gone to a different level now. And in terms of sea control, which is obviously any conflict between the United States and China and Australia and China is going to be an air-sea battle, and it is all about controlling the sea lanes of communication. And both sides try to, there's an intersection here between the political and military domains of conflict, where one side will try to push the other one or make the other one look bad and try and exercise de facto control over international waters. And that is where we are right now at the very beginning.
There is the view here in Australia that we would never get to this sort of level without following the US's lead. What has the Biden administration's approach been to China so far? How is the US-China relationship going to differ, do you think, from under the Trump era?
Well, the problem for Australia and for the United States is that there is no coherent strategy, American strategy with regards to China, none whatsoever. at least during the Trump years, the Chinese understood where America was. The best way to think of it is, under Trump, the Chinese did not take Trump literally, but they took him seriously. And the Chinese do not take Biden seriously when he has yet to articulate a clear policy towards Asia. And when the United States was humiliated by the Chinese in the Anchorage summit, and when you have the United States pivoting to environmental issues, which, while important, are not a substitute for dealing with the substantive trade, economic, territorial, and military issues in the region. And the Biden administration is just not delivering anything clear on that front. And that creates a lot of risk, and because it creates the opportunity for uncertainty and miscalculation. And the other side perhaps stepping over one of those red lines without even realizing that is a red line for that other side. That's how World War I started. The book that comes to mind, Infringement, and I don't mean just a flyby or a ship cutting through the international to territorial waters, but some sort of direct attack on Taiwan would also do it, or Japan, or South Korea, or any attempt by China to interfere with sea lanes as they go near Chinese territory for international trade. Those would probably almost certainly be red lines. But I'm a history buff, and I know a lot of people watch the show. You're pretty well read. And the book that comes to mind is Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, when you have high tensions, political feelings are running high, and you have one or more sides that don't really have a clearly communicated policy to the other one. One side being misunderstood or being perceived as weaker or willing to tolerate more, and the other side perhaps stepping over one of those red lines without even realizing that there's a red line for that other side. That's how World War I started. And the other side perhaps stepping over one of those red lines without even realizing that there's a red line for that other side. That's how World War I started.
John Jordan, hopefully we won't get to that point. Appreciate your insights and analysis. Thanks so much for joining us live there from California. We appreciate your time.
This guy's turning inbound. Bath one's turning inbound. Yeah, I got the flares. 252 WCO track aft VIAC turning inbound at this time.
The biggest fuel pipeline system in the United States remains crippled by a cyber attack that's being called the worst of its kind in the US. The Colonial Pipeline ships more than 2.5 million barrels of oil a day from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast, but it has been shut down since Friday. Today, emergency powers were invoked to try to avoid fuel shortages. President Biden says there is no evidence of Russian government involvement, but there are some signs that the attack originated in Russia. Here's our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera.
Colonial Pipeline, tonight still not pumping fuel across America, thanks to a cyber attack. 4 days after hackers infiltrated its systems, its pipeline is still shut down. A development serious enough to lead President Biden to speak out this evening.
The Department of Energy is working directly with Colonial to get the pipelines back online and operating at full capacity as quickly and safely as possible. The FBI also is engaged to assess and address this attack.
Colonial's 5,500-mile pipeline carries nearly half of all the fuel for America's East Coast, from Texas up to the Northeast. Emergency powers have allowed tankers to carry more to avoid shortages, including at airports. What's called ransomware has become a profitable enterprise. The hackers behind this incident even licensing their software for others to use. They're thought to be based in Russia, but criminals rather than part of the government. The group call themselves DarkSide. Today they put out a statement saying, "We are apolitical and do not participate in geopolitics. Don't tie us to governments," they say. "Our goal is to make money and not creating problems for society." It looks like they may be worried that this time things have gone too far.
What they've done is they've taken some data, encrypted it, and they're holding it for ransom. And they're saying if they don't get paid, they're going to leak it on the internet. And likely this company is going to be either needing to pay it off or getting some sort of help from the US government, because the longer this goes on, you could start to see supplies eventually, not this week, but soon, start to get a bit tight, and that's going to drive up energy prices.
Colonials say they hope to restore systems by the end of the week, but this is not just about fuel supplies. Hospitals, police forces, even local councils in the UK have all in the past been hit by a ransomware threat that's still growing. Gordon Carrera, BBC News.